the Institute for the Study of Peak States presents the second International Psychoimmunology and Psychobiology Research Symposium. Interoception, the Science of How We Feel, presented by Joy Nauman.
For our next presenter, we have Dr. Joy Nauman. She's a naturopathic doctor, midwife, and researcher practicing primary care medicine in Yakima, Washington. She recently completed the ISBS trauma therapist training and is working with Dr. Mary Pelletier in our applied research team. So Joy, over to you.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? I've got the ear pods in.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. And I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. Okay. And I have some flexibility in my presentation here. So if there's questions that come up, we can go through them. So this is my first time presenting in this sort of way. So feel free to ask questions as they come up, and I'll just go through. I'm going to kind of do a broad strokes introduction to like the nervous system and interoception. Let's see here. Go on to the next slide. So my background, so I am a naturopathic doctor. I'm a midwife, trained as a midwife. I have a private practice in Yakima, Washington. I specialize in pediatrics, women's health, natural childbirth. I do a lot of complex functional GI complaints, chronic illness, and my research and my focus and my passion is in mind-body medicine. So, of course, I've been very attracted to the ISPS work that's being done. So I met Mary when I first moved to Yakima, and we worked together on a program, a community program, and through our conversations together, I can't even remember how it came about, but now I'm with the staff as a primary investigator for the ISPS applied research team. With our primary goal of getting our work into mainstream journals and mainstream medical. So a lot of my position here is how do we explain the model of what we're doing in a way that makes sense to a more conventional audience. So that's what I'm going to kind of talk more today is going to be a more of a conventional approach. And just based on my research, I'm pretty new to the ISPS work. I guess it was about a year ago that I was doing the training because it was when COVID hit that we were doing our third module. So pretty new to it, still learning. And a lot of this I want to present and just kind of put out there and see how does this land within this community? How does this work within the ISPS model? And just to kind of start a conversation about it. I'm also a postdoctoral affiliate researcher or investigator with the HealthGot Research Institute in Portland, Oregon. That's part of the National University of Natural Medicine, and that's where I did my training. And I'm currently seeking the National Institutes of Health grant funding. So a lot of work that I do with the Research Institute is in mind-body medicine, again, in a more conventional model, but we're in natural medicine. So of course, we're looking at the body holistically and looking at it not as a reductionist view, but looking more holistically. My personal primary research focus is in investigating resiliency in children in order to mitigate the effects of adverse childhood experiences and chronic disease using mind-body therapies such as ISPS work. The NCCIH, that's the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, has a huge focus on interoception, which is what we're going to talk about today, in mind-body medicine. And so there's a lot of money to be thrown at this topic. So that's really exciting, especially what Shane was talking about earlier this morning about wanting to get more grant funding or more research or more opportunities. So that's part of my position as well, as providing a potential bridge for that. So starting off with interoception. So basically, there's a few slides before I actually give you the definition of what that is, but interoception is basically the science of how we feel. And it's an emerging science that's come around in the last 15, 20 years. It's been around for a long time, this idea, but we're finally able to map it out and look at the neuroscience of it within the last 15 years or so. And then in the last 5 years has really taken a huge huge jump in the research, medical research field. So it's basically explaining in a scientific way what is the mind-body connection and how we experience our feelings. So to start, I just wanted to give a little overview of the nervous system. So we have the peripheral nervous system, that's our nerves here, that's come out from the spine, from the cranial nerves and from the spine, that innervate our entire body. And its primary focus or primary purpose is to modulate the autonomic nervous system. That's the parasympathetic and sympathetic arms of that. That's the parasympathetic being the rest and digest, and the sympathetic being fight or flight, just in very, very simplistic terms. And then the somatic nervous system is muscle, skeletal muscle. So how we move, how we physically move, raise arm, that sort of a thing. Then the central nervous system, that includes the spinal cord, the brainstem, and the brain. And that receives and interprets the signals from the peripheral nervous system and then spits out what you should do with it. So it takes in the information and then gives the body signals for what to do about it. So here is a diagram that I hope will be available post-conference or post-symposium, because it is pretty detailed, but I kind of like this. It kind of shows in a schematic way, going back, in a schematic way how the system works. So we have sensory receptors in all of our cells that give information, and afferent, meaning it's affecting, so that going into the central nervous system, that's the brain, where it's integrated, processed, and coordinated with that sensory data. And then it gives a command, and that's the efferent division. So if you're reading some of this research, or if I talk, afferent meaning going in, efferent meaning coming out. And that includes then the somatic nervous system that goes to the skeletal muscle. Like I said, you get a sense that you need to get up and walk. So you get these, it affects your skeletal muscles so that your legs, arms, body needs to move. And then the autonomic nervous system, and that's the parasympathetic, rest and digest, and the sympathetic divisions. And that affects the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, your glands, your adipose tissue, affects all other aspects of your body. In interoception, we're mainly looking at the visceral sensory receptors. So here's another diagram just to kind of highlight the central nervous system versus the peripheral. And I brought this up mainly just to talk a little bit about the frontal lobe of our brain. So our brains are structured in different sections here. We have different lobes. Let's see. And the frontal lobe is where we process most of this. So information comes in from a peripheral nervous system, travels up the spine, through the brainstem, through here, and in humans goes to the frontal lobe. And then there's a particular fold. This is when we're talking about, I'm not a neuroscientist, but so I'll speak very generally, but these folds then will interpret different information and cause us to act or behave or not act or behave. Yes. Okay. So the vagus nerve is really important when we talk about interoception. This is the 10th cranial nerves. There are 12 cranial nerves that come from our brain and go throughout the body and do different things. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve. It's Latin for wandering. So it wanders throughout the whole body. So you can see it affects all the systems of our bodies. So there are gut, our spleen, our liver, our heart, our lungs, all this information comes in. And it conveys the information between our visceral organs and the brain. And it's composed primarily of afferent fibers, so information going to the brain, though there are some pathways that bring down and affect the system. And it basically modulates homeostasis. And I'll talk a little bit about homeostasis here in a little bit. So I'm just going to drop that word there, but we're going to pick it up back up and talk about it in a minute. But the vagus nerve is really interesting. Right now, there's a lot of really current research looking at dysautonomia, which is a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are not communicating properly. And this is really important right now because of post-COVID symptoms in the long haul. If you've heard about post-COVID syndrome or long haul systems, for whatever reason, the virus has messed up the vagus nerve, and the afferent and efferent are not working properly. And so you get odd symptoms like shortness of breath when you shouldn't, or racing heartbeat when you shouldn't have a racing heartbeat, those sorts of things. So, and dysautonomia and interoception go hand in hand. So that's why I bring that up here. So what are all the ceptions that we have? So the body is dependent on the nervous system to receive and interpret input from the environment. So each signal that we get is either classified as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So everything that we take in, it gets processed through the brain and then coming out. If it is pleasant, then it will produce positive neurotransmitters like dopamine. That's a reward pathway, or oxytocin, that's our love feeling, all these things. If it's unpleasant, it might come out as pain, or there might be a need to stop what you're doing. So we have exteroception, and that is what we think of when we think of taste, sound, smell, vision, touch. And then touch is divided out to be light touch and pressure, sharp or dull, or hot or cold. And touch itself is actually pretty integrated with interoception. We also have proprioception, and that's the position of our body in space. So how we kind of balance and feel different things around us in space. And then interoception is the perceptions of sensations from inside the body. So the purpose of interoception and the purpose of this system is to maintain homeostasis. And homeostasis is the ongoing maintenance and defense of vital physiological variables such as blood pressure and blood sugar. And the purpose of homeostasis is to maintain the energy usage of the body for survival. So our whole purpose is to conserve as much energy as possible. So when we need to run from a bear, we're able to run from the bear. Of course, as we know, homeostasis can be dysfunctional. We've read and heard about that one. There is new research proposing that there's an aspect of homeostasis called allostasis. And allostasis is kind of a higher level thinking of homeostasis. It's the ability for the individual to change according to certain circumstances. Allostasis explains how we're able to adapt to stressors. So those two concepts are really important in terms of interoception. All right, so now I'm going to tell you what interoception is. So it is the perception of sensations from inside the body, and includes the perception of physical sensations related to internal organ functions such as our heartbeat, respiration, satiety, as well as the autonomic nervous system activity related to emotions. So that comes from Bud Craig. That is his definition, and he is one of the main researchers when it comes to interoception. And I'll talk about him in a little bit. And these signals are transmitted through blood and neurological pathways. So it uses our hormones, certain chemicals, all these things. It involves the immune system, endocrine system, the gut, brain, microbiota axis, all of it. So interoception is just basically the science of how all of these signals, chemical and neurological, are interpreted in the brain. And it is hierarchical. There are low-level visceral signals, such as like, why do we drink water when we're thirsty? Well, it's our vessels, our blood vessels change, and the osmolarity of our blood changes, and that causes our blood vessels to stretch, which raises the blood pressure. All that information goes to the brain and then sends a signal. The brain processes that and says, oh, I'm thirsty, I'll take a drink of water. But it also includes, just our emotional feelings and sensations, and like these feelings come up before we're able to interpret them. So really, we think about ourselves as being conscious beings, thinking our way through life, when really what we're doing is more so is we're having sensations, emotions come up, and we're trying to interpret that and process that. So it's kind of a paradigm shifting thought with this science. So because I do a lot of gut health stuff, and in naturopathic medicine, of course, we're really interested in digestive processes, and health begins in the gut in our model. Well, not everybody, but in a lot of naturopathic medicine. This is an example of how interoception works on a functional physiological level. So in our digestive tracts, there are specific recently we just found out these neuropod cells in the small intestinal walls, they connect with the sensory center of the vagus nerves that are integral in visceral and signaling pathways, which regulates gut motility. That's how food and water things move through the body, and inflammation. They travel through the peripheral nervous system, goes through the limbic system, and then processed in the insular cortex and in the frontal lobe and the cingulate cortices, and these areas that are specific to humans. And then the body sends signals, or then brain sends signals back to the body to what to do. And some hypothesize that most of our epigenetic changes happen in the gut, and is influenced by the gut microbiome. So I think that kind of speaks to what Celine and Grant have been saying about epigenetic changes in ISPS work. A lot of this is happening in the gut. Okay, so interoceptive predictive processing, IPP, it's a psychological theory regarding how the brain makes sense of the body's place in the world. So in interoception research, in the literature and the psychological and medical research, this is an emerging theory. And basically what it's saying is that as these signals are coming in from the body and as they're processed through the brain, and I have a diagram showing this in a couple slides, if there are interruptions to that, the brain doesn't know how to predict properly, and it will start to overreact or underreact to certain signals. This is where we get anxiety and depression. So if you are overreacting to signals that are coming into the body, you might have increased anxiety. If you're underreacting, you might have depression. For example, in individuals with IBS, they've done studies and they're thinking about and paying attention to visceral sensations. It's increased, while interpreting that visceral pain and emotional arousal is decreased. So in certain patients with IBS, they're paying attention to these signals that are coming in from their gut and overreacting to it. So, and then the brain is spitting out an overreaction. So what that can look like for some people is diarrhea and pain, and then anxiety or depression about it, which kind of explains the high comorbidities of anxiety and depression in individuals with IBS. So ACEs and ELA, these are somewhat interchangeable when you read the medical and psychological journals. ACEs is adverse childhood events. ELA is early life adversity. So this is where we get into our trauma-focused treatments. But in my particular interest in this work is working with children and working to mitigate these adverse life experiences. So experiencing trauma in childhood can predispose an individual to chronic and mental physical illness in adulthood. And that is pretty well established. We pretty much have figured that out. And mainly that happens because the chronic stress permanently alters the stress response. So these fight or flight moments, they increase blood pressure, they increase glucose release, retention of fat cells, all of these things are chronically happening. So in adulthood, then we have hypertension, obesity, type 2 diabetes, it alters epigenetics, all these things, and it leads to dysregulation in the interoceptive process. So this is one of my favorite diagrams. Again, I'm not a neuroscience scientist, so these, I'm not sure what all of these acronyms here are, but basically you've got your visceral organs here. Maybe you have a sensation coming up, an emotion coming up. That comes in through the hypothalamus, through the amygdala. This is where our fight or flight, fear centers are. If it is working properly, it goes through to the frontal lobe, to the insular and anterior, the cingulate cortices, and it gets processed in a higher level of thinking. So where we consciously interpret it and sometimes, consciously and unconsciously interpret these things. And then we have allostatic prediction. So this is change to the stress response that then gives homeostatic reflexes. So when this is working properly, we have a sensation come in, we decide, is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? We make a prediction about it. Do we need to do something? Do we need to not do something? And then that influences our homeostatic reflexes. But when there is trauma or something that comes in and breaks that up, it gets stuck in this area here. It does not go to the frontal lobe where we're able to process it and correctly, release the dopamine or release the oxytocin as needed. It gets stuck in this fight or flight, in this fear place, pain, and a lot of pain centers are here. So this is where chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, some of these overreactions, IBS, anxiety, neurological disorders, addiction, all of these things that we are seeing and working with are because this interoceptive process is not working properly. So how do we measure interoception? So there are two ways that we measure it, because it's really difficult to figure out how we measure how people feel. So there's the Chandry's heartbeat detection task. That's the most common one that is used, and that is where we have participants sit quietly in a room, hook them up to an EKG or an ECG machine, and participants are asked to sit quietly and perceive their heartbeat. And either they'll tap it, like what their heart rate is, or I think that's mainly the way that they do it. And the researchers or the clinicians then look at the ECG machine and see if they're correct. So how correct you are at perceiving your own heartbeat is a measure of how good you are at your interoceptive processes. There's also a questionnaire that is used. It's the multidimensional assessment of interoceptive awareness. There's a second edition now. It's a self-report, basically just answering questions in the moment. And there's 37 items with 8 domains. There's noticing, and in terms of emotions and physical sensations, we're measuring noticing, not distracting, not worrying, attention regulation, emotional awareness, self-regulation, body listening, and trusting. So there are therapies to improve interoceptive awareness. This is where we all come in. So yoga, breathing exercises, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, interoceptively focused cognitive behavioral therapy. These are 2 that are being researched right now. There's vagal nerve stimulation, where they surgically go in and physically stimulate the vagus nerve. And that has been shown to help. Acupuncture, and of course the work we're doing with ISBS. So this is a book by Bug Craig. He's one of the researchers. Oh, there's my kids. They're cute. And I got really interested in this field of research, and I listened to a podcast, and he was being interviewed by Dr. Ginger Campbell. And it was episode 121, and there's a link somewhere if you wanted to look it up. But the takeaway from all of this is that the most important, and I won't read all of this, but the most important thing is to know that our interoceptive awareness can change and it can be improved, especially in children. So we've been taught that the cognitive mind is superior. We've been told that what differentiates between humans, or as humans as a unique species, is that we can control our emotions and so on. But really, it's the opposite. It's our emotions coming up and how we interpret them. So the best thing that we can do in order to change this and to make changes is to teach our children how to feel and recognize and acknowledge and say, hey, I see that you are feeling angry, and give them words for these sensations that are coming up and helping them process that. And these are 2 kiddos that we're working with that right now. That's my Nico and my Nora right there. And here is my contact information. If you want more questions, there's my references. You can be reached at this email. That's my website. That's my personal cell phone. If you want a consultation or make an appointment, you can call my office. So there we go. And then references that were mentioned. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Shane, if there are any questions coming up.
Okay, so we got one question here. What is your opinion on HRV measurements?
Oh yes, heart rate variability. That yes, very much is being used as well. A little bit less so because it isn't. So heart rate variability, for people who don't know, that's what HRV is, and that is measuring the difference. There's like milliseconds between each heartbeat that can change, and if you're under chronic stress, they get longer or shorter, and there's like different waves about it. But yes, that is another way that we are measuring interoception, autonomic dysregulation, all of these things, as well as cortisol. Those are other measures of interoception and autonomic dysautonomia.
Okay, I think that looks like it's the only question that we have. So thank you very much, Joy. Appreciate that. It's great to get people with medical background, and the work that we're doing is so different, such a new framework, to be able to get the translation of what's current science actually, their terminology, and what are they discovering, and what are we actually seeing, and how can we start to create a bridge. So thank you for starting to do that for us. Okay, bye, Joy.
Thank you for watching. For more information, visit drjoynauman.com.